Shabbat Shalom, everyone. This week's Torah portion is called Ki Teitzei, and we are coming down to the home stretch of the book of Deuteronomy. And this is so close to the end that Moses seems to be trying to fill in and include as many different reminders of laws that we have seen before and laws that we have not yet seen, all in this portion. It is full of mitzvot. And it's a little bit of a sense, perhaps, of Moses feeling a kind of rushed because the topics jump around. But one thing that I notice in one particular paragraph really stands out. Mostly in the Torah, we find statements, narratives, quotations. We find what people did, where they went, what they said, and not a lot of descriptive information around that. Uh, and so when the Torah gives us something more, I think it's worth paying attention to. One example of this occurs, and it's a very striking example, in the book of Genesis when Joseph's brothers throw him into the pit. And the Torah tells us that the pit was empty, there was no water in it, so nothing. And they throw him into the pit, and then they sit down to eat. They sit down to eat, even though their brother is probably screaming his head off for them to pull him out. What does this tell us about the brothers? How much do they really detest Joseph if they can just calmly sit down to a meal after what they have done to him? And so that's one example of how the Torah uses an unusual detail, an uncommon bit of narrative and sort of character development to bring more depth to an episode. And here in Deuteronomy, in chapter 24, we have this particular paragraph about when you are dealing with someone who is poorer than you. So, for instance, and this is chapter 24 and beginning at verse 10. When you make a loan of any sort to your countryman, you must not enter his house to seize his pledge. You must remain outside while the man to whom you made the loan brings the pledge out to you. If he is a needy man, you shall not go to sleep and not let him go to sleep with his pledge in your possession. You must return to his pledge to him at sundown, that he may sleep in his cloth and bless you. It will be to your merit before the Lord your God. So we're assuming that this is a person who is so poor that he has to pawn his cloak, and his cloak actually serves as a blanket at night. So this is someone who is really, really destitute. And even though that cloak is collateral for the money that you have loaned him, you cannot leave him to sleep without it, without even a blanket at night. And it will be to your merit. So there is an element here of the spirit versus the letter of the practice of people pawning their garments because they are so poor. And the Torah goes on, you shall not abuse a needy and desperate and destitute laborer, whether a fellow countryman or a stranger in one of the communities of your land. You must pay him his wages on the same day before the sun sets, for he is needy and urgently depends on it. Else he will cry out to Adonai against you, and you will incur guilt. So he is needy. His need is urgent. And the Torah emphasizes the position of this borrower because this laborer who is working day to day, he cannot even live week to week. He is working day to day. He needs his day's wages immediately. And for the Torah to tell us that he is urgently needing, I think what the Torah is saying here is, yes, you're in a position of power because you have the money to lend, and he is powerless because he is so poor. But have empathy. Don't make him wait for the wages that he has earned. Have empathy. Recognize how much he depends on getting that small amount of money, no matter how small, that he needs it right away. Have a sense of where the other person is. What is his situation? Have empathy. And so the Torah goes beyond just saying, if you're paying someone a daily wage, you should pay it daily because that's what you said and that's what you agreed on. It's not just a matter of the conditions of employment. It is the matter of the attitude of you, the employer, toward those who depend on that work. And I think this is especially important in times of economic distress when we do have people who are that needy, who live paycheck to paycheck. And a promise of a good wage for which someone has to wait is really not a very good promise. Here is the Torah telling us about labor relations. Treat your workers with dignity. Treat your workers as though you respect the work that they do for you and understand their position. You may not have ever walked in similar shoes. Nevertheless, have a care. Have a care for those who depend on you, even if they are not in your family. So, again, this is another striking example of how the Torah, which is so sparing in descriptive detail, so careful to leave us room for interpretation generation after generation, here inserts a reminder when we interpret. This is the direction in which we should look. Have a care for those who are less fortunate than you. It doesn't say that you should be ashamed of being wealthy. It doesn't even say that you have a special responsibility to employ people when you have money to spend and they are in need, that you should find work for people, although that's a pretty good thing to do, to find honest work for people so that they may earn their keep and have dignity. But the Torah does say, when you execute the terms of an agreement, of a contract, if you are the one in the position of the powerful, of the more responsible, the more comfortable, think about who the other guy really is. Think about his or her situation. And even though we're not talking here about finding work, creating work for those who are needy, I think that's also a very important principle in the Torah's many mitzvot and many mentions of gleaning, that you leave the corners of your field for the poor. You leave once you have gone over your fields. You don't go back. You leave what's left, what you may have missed, so that poor people can come and their work in gleaning may seem demeaning, and yet it adds some dignity to the fact that they did work, that this is not pure charity. We're not creating a sense of entitled poor people. So the Torah is careful to recognize the dignity of work, the dignity of reward, of payment, and the importance of the relationship between the worker and the employer. If that is indeed based on honesty and respect and empathy, then it will be a successful relationship. The worker will be paid promptly, appropriately. He will feed himself and his family, and the accounts are clear. The accounts are even. So, very important message um, for our ancestors who are about to be in the position, we hope, of being employers, of having gotten through the struggle of 40 years of wandering and learning how to be self-sufficient. And just a word about our Haftarah portion. This is the fifth Haftarah of consolation, the fifth week since Tisha B'Av, and really only 3 more weeks until Rosh Hashanah. And it is about the return of God's love as people have returned from exile in Babylonia, feeling that God has abandoned them in their exile. And God reassures all of the returnees. And this is Isaiah chapter 54, if you want to look for it. Returning to security, returning to a sense of God's presence in their lives as individuals and as a community, and that God promises after this period of suffering and exile that God's love will endure eternally. God loves the people Israel, and God will not hide God's face from us. So we have messages about empathy. This week we have messages about relationships on a small scale, employer and worker, on a large scale, God and Israel, on a societal scale among the people of Israel, Am Yisrael. Relationships are at the heart of what Torah does, and really at the heart of our faith and our survival, our endurance as a people. May this Shabbat find you knowing that you are part of something larger than yourself, that includes you, and that includes God's love for you. Shabbat Shalom.